Well, let's now keep the conversation going. For more on the African Nations Championship, I'm joined in studio by sports consultant Arnold Kanyangonda. Arnold, thanks for joining us once again this side of the new year. Just how important would you describe the CHAN tournament for African countries?
Well, I mean, the tournament was mooted because Africa has always had a championship. In fact, it's the second oldest in the world, the African Cup of Nations. But over the years, the best players from Africa no longer play in Africa. They play in other countries or usually in Europe and other parts of the world. And so while you saw the best African players at the African Cup of Nations, you didn't see the best players playing in Africa, and that's why this tournament was mooted. Now, some have argued that it should be open to everybody playing within Africa, but the other side of the conversation was that the national leagues need to be strengthened, and so it's only players playing in their home leagues that can play in CHAN. So it's a brilliant platform for players playing in their own countries to represent their own countries. In fact, there are some who would argue that for it to be a truly national team, every player on that team has to be playing at home, and so in a sense, the African Cup of Nations is even more African. CHAN is even more African than the African Cup of Nations, exactly.
Right. Now, of course, you do mention that it is a chance for local players to shine. This is a World Cup year. We have teams like Nigeria and Morocco who will also be participating in CHAN. Just how crucial is this maybe for these local players, maybe to try and get a slot at the World Cup level?
Yeah, I think it's a golden opportunity. Remember, this is the first time CHAN is taking place in a World Cup year. Previously, it was 2009, 2011, then there was one in 14 years, then 16. But if you look at how it's set up, most of the African teams will take mostly foreign-based players. Remember, a team like Algeria, the last World Cup, 16 of the whole team was born in France, okay? And so it's a chance, it's a golden chance for players. Like we remember Sandemba for Nigeria at the 2012 Nations Cup was one of the very few locally based players. So if you're a local based player, you look at this and you think, wait, the African Cup of Nations used to be during World Cup years. It no longer is. This is my chance to stake a claim, because I'll tell you what, the top scorer at that tournament, if he belongs to Morocco or Nigeria or another team that's going to the World Cup, it would be very, very hard for his coach to say, no, you're not going to the World Cup in favor of somebody else.
Right. And of course, now talking about the World Cup, we have 5 African teams obviously representing the continent. Which team would you say can go the farthest in Russia?
I said that here the last time I was here, right before the draw, I said, take a good look at Egypt and Nigeria to some degree, and Senegal now, with the draw having come out, Egypt looks to have gotten a very favorable draw.
Indeed, yeah.
Senegal looks to have gotten a very favorable draw. Now, Nigeria, you get the feeling that it's time for them to get past the round of 16, which is the farthest they've gone. They've done that, what, 3 times? Yeah. You get the feeling that this is a team that qualified. After failing to qualify for AFCON, they had all sorts of difficulties, but qualifying for the World Cup, they almost breezed through.
Yeah, it was an easy path.
And they had Zambia and Cameroon in their group. So if you've come through that, if you've beaten recent African champions to get to the World Cup, and built on the back of their last World Cup performance, people forget this, but they got to the round of 16. You get the feeling that Nigeria is due a quarterfinal place. Senegal, they've only had 1 World Cup appearance, but that was a magical experience. They
never forget it.
They came minutes of the semi-final. And then, of course, you've got Egypt. The last 28 years, Egypt has had some of the best teams, not just African football, but world football has ever seen. They haven't gone for the World Cup. And in as much as I've never been a big fan of Egypt, they stopped Kenya going for World Cup back in the day. I've always said that when Egypt will qualify for the World Cup, watch out. The next time Egypt qualifies for the World Cup, I think even for them as a country, their minimum level is the quarterfinal. So maybe I sound dreamy, but if all this comes to pass, this may yet be the best World Cup Africa has had, beating Brazil when, for the first time, 2 teams qualified for the second round. This time, we might have 3.
I'll hold you to that, and while we watch the World Cup, actually, in a few months' time. And finally, obviously, the CHAN tournament takes place today, kicks off today, but we were talking about this just a bit earlier. A chance for Morocco is a lost opportunity for Kenya, who lost the hosting rights. What went wrong for us?
Well, it's very simple. As I was telling you earlier, right before we got on air, as soon as the tournament was awarded, I said on another show, if the government does, and this was in February 2016, Kenya is not going to host CHAN. And I was asked why, and I said, because the government, I don't think, is committed to building stadia. Now remember, in this part of the world, you don't have private stadia. Just about all stadia are built by government, either the central government or the county government. And for as long as there was no progress in building new stadia, a new stadium has not been opened in Kenya for 32 years now. And so for as long as no new stadium is opening, you can't host. Now, Kenya is better placed than most African countries in terms of telecommunications, the road network, the hotels, everything else you need to host a football tournament. But the most important part, the park on which the players play and the infrastructure around it, Kenya doesn't have that. And so it was obvious to anybody who knows sports that Kenya wasn't going to host. It's a lost opportunity for Kenya, massively lost opportunity, almost as big as the 96 Nations Cup. But for Morocco, they're serious about football. They're ready from the start. The word is they're using this as a platform to perhaps then host AFCON next year if Cameroon is unable to. But ultimately, their goal is to host the World Cup in 2026. Remember, Morocco has been to host the World Cup, I think, 4 previous times before. Right. There is word that in 2010, shenanigans led to them not being awarded the hosting rights, despite being almost as well qualified, if not better qualified than South Africa. And so all told, when one African country decides not to take football seriously, let another one that wants to take it seriously do it. Of course, Morocco is trying to ingratiate itself once again with African football after refusing to host AFCON in 2015. But you know what? Let people who are serious about it have it. And you hope that this has taught the Kenyans some lessons in the sense that, look, these things are not jokes anymore. I mean, you need to be serious about this, Indeed. But that remains to be seen. Hopefully Kenya can learn something from this. Arnold, thank you once again for joining us on Match Point. Arnold Kanyangonda, sports consultant, speaking to us as we get ready to kick off action at the African Nations Championship.